Once upon a time in Nazi-occupied France, a young Spanish woman by the name of Paulina Banderas lived in a small cottage atop a green, scenic hill. Her property was often trespassed upon by her neighbor's herd of Mont Baliard cows, but she didn't mind. After all, she was often given free bottles of milk in exchange for the extra acres. Her days were spent mostly inside, painting. The entirety of her humble farmhouse had been converted into a full-time studio where unfinished works lined every wall and covered every surface. Today, the only piece on an easel was an intricate landscape depicting the island of Mykonos. Supposedly, anyway. It was anachronistic, to say the least, with towering mountains and no shoreline to speak of, but that did little to change how she thought of the piece. If you had asked her at any point in the creative process what she was painting, her answer would have always been the same, a landscape of Mykonos. Today was a day of slow progress, lots of pacing around the room and staring at the half-finished work, very little else. And this was only made worse when she heard the hum of an approaching vehicle from outside. She peered through the slit of her curtain and was disappointed to find she was right. The Gestapo was parked outside. Paulina's history as an abstract artist before the war had made her a target to the National Socialist Party, and since the start of their occupation in France, they had sent officers once every few weeks to ensure her art was free of any degenerate ideologies. At first they'd send an entire team of 6 to 8 men, but these days they'd only send 2. A senior officer named Maximilian Bab and one of his lackeys, usually a teenage boy by the name of Heinrich Kappler. She stared through her window as the Onyx Mercedes pulled to a stop before her meager cabin and as the officers inside climbed out from its seats. She watched as Officer Bab brushed off the front of his lapel and made his way toward her front door. She met him there. "Officer, how are you doing this lovely afternoon?" "Charmed as always, Miss Banderas. May you invite me inside?" "Why, of course. Come on in." Bab removed his cap and held it about his waist as he entered the modest homestead. Heinrich leaned his weight against the open door frame, refusing to enter fully, just as he refused to shut the door. Le déjeuner chez les Hebas, Paulina's elderly barn cat, approached from the kitchen and hissed at the 2 officers. Her pupils sharpened as her fur stood on end. A harsh twang of anxiety coursed through Paulina's body as she ran to grab the cat by the scruff of its neck. But as she did, she found the officer was only laughing at the perceived transgression. "You needn't fret, my dear. Animals have never been too kind to me." Paulina laughed nervously as she hurried Le Déjeuner out the back door. "I'm sorry, that's why I usually keep her outside when I have guests." "You get many guests beyond us?" "Well, not exactly, sir, but when I do." Bab nodded, then turned to the numerous paintings. Where to start? He looked to the landscape of Montezuma, resting on its easel. "This isn't the piece from last week, is it?" "Yes, sir, it is. Looks pretty different, huh?" "I'll say. Last time it was pink, and now it's... what would you call that? Aquamarine? Did you have to repaint it from scratch?" "No, actually, I just painted over. And it didn't take as long as you'd think. The only tricky part was the window." She gestured to the bottom right of the canvas, a tiny church scene with stained glass in the shape of a cross. Last week, the painted window was comprised of warm colors, but in the days since, she had changed it to cooler hues, mostly blues and indigos. Beams of colored light passed through a crowd of singing Greek Orthodox. "I'm no expert, but yes, that certainly looks intricate," Officer Bab said as he held his hand against his chin, studying the piece. The black dirt building beneath his nails made them look more like the talons of a beast than that of a man. His face was round, puffy, and white, covered in acne scars, and while his teeth were technically clean, they were coffee-stained. He tapped his black fingernail against the top left corner of the canvas at a tiny illustration of a little man standing on the crest of a hill. In his right hand, the man held a torch. In his left, a photograph of a powder-white house with a red door. The picture was engulfed in flames. "And who's this, then? A tiny man burning a house?" "It's an illustration of my childhood home. The burnt picture, I mean." "Where'd you grow up?" "A little town in western Spain, El Ferrol." "It doesn't look like you enjoyed your time growing up in El Ferrol, Spain." "No, sir. Certain ideologies made it hard to live down there." "I see. I didn't notice him last time. Is he new?" "Not entirely, no. He used to be a young woman, and that torch started off as a flaming carnation. I changed it for clarity, I guess." "You know, some of my officers like to lump you in with the other degenerate artists, but I appreciate your work." Paulina stewed for a moment too long before responding. "Thank you, sir. I've seen them on auction a couple times in town. I've even thought about placing a bid, but they're a bit beyond my budget, to be perfectly frank." "That means a lot to me, sir." Bob turned his attention to another painting, an olive-skinned man holding a cedar bush tail above his head, all before a gold, radiant background. The officer furrowed his brow. "Alright, now this one here. This character, would you by any chance describe him as valiant?" "Well, it's supposed to be an image of a window, so yes, I suppose I would." Maximilian held his thumb against the painting's skin. It was a shade darker than his own. That's what I was afraid of. If that's the case, then his complexion is far too dark. I don't mean to imply you may have painted an African hero. He could just as easily be Greek or maybe even Italian. But these are turbulent times, and it's better safe than sorry. He'll have to come with me. Heinrich, who had grown bored by the grown-ups' conversation, eagerly grabbed the painting by its frame and flung it over his shoulder. Wait, hold on, you can't just take him. I'm afraid you're sorely mistaken, Miss Banderas. No, please, I can just change his skin color. And if it were up to me, I'd let you. But like I said, we're living in turbulent times. Toss him in the car, would you, Heinrich? Grinning, Heinrich stomped across Polina's dirt driveway and tossed the painting in the back seat of the Mercedes. Le Déjeuner yowled and scratched at his legs as he made his way back to the house, and he would have kicked the ailing house cat if only his senior officer hadn't been there to witness. Bab took a cursory glance about the rest of the room. Most of the other paintings had already been cleared in previous visits. Well, my dear, I suppose that's it for today. Sorry about the trouble there. I'll see you next week. Yeah, till then. The two officers climbed back into the car with Heinrich behind the wheel. The young man tore down the dirt road, spitting great plumes of dust into the once fresh air. As the Gestapo mobile vanished upon the horizon, Polina screamed and punched a hole in one of her old paintings. The work in question depicted a skeletal man in a red uniform. She took a deep breath and gathered her supplies. Great progress was made in the next few hours. She changed the colors of Mykonos for a second time, but she didn't repaint. The finished scenes kept their dark blue palettes, but the rest were finalized in a vibrant array of bright, hellish reds and deep scarlet. In the end, she was left with something of a patchwork, half somber, half furious, each evenly spurred with the other. For the next 2 hours, she stood and stared at the top left corner, at the little man and his tiny torch. The canvas as a whole was 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The little man took up less than 6 square inches. He was hardly visible, but far from an afterthought. She had painted over the burning house, the only repaint she had made all day. In its place, she painted a portrait. A portrait that the little man would burn with his tiny torch. A portrait of Adolf Hitler. The next day, she wrapped the landscape of Montezuma in a burlap sheet, along with 2 other finished paintings, Still Life of a Homestead Door and Study of a Severed Ox Head. She affixed all 3 to her back, mounted her bicycle, and rode to town. Gaverny was a small village about an hour's drive from Paris, and home to the Beaumont Art Studio, where Edith Beaumont would purchase paintings from Banderas and a handful of other artists from the nearby towns. She would resell the purchased works to auctioneers in the big city. Polina always enjoyed her commute to the studio, especially in the early hours of the morning when the spring sun painted the skies in warm pinks and sent sharp shadows across the landscape. The cool, country air was laden with morning dew, and not even the roosters had rose to full attention by the time she had reached the Beaumont's building. Once there, she propped her bike lengthwise aside the mossy stone wall and rested her paintings against the doorframe before peering through the darkened windows with her hands pressed against the glass like visors. The room inside was dark and vacant. Not even the coffee was brewed. No matter. Polina rummaged through the nearby flower beds and produced a smooth river stone, just a bit bigger than her thumb. She rolled it between her palms, allowing the built-up dirt to flake off, then flung it full speed at the second-story apartment. It twanged against the upstairs window, then tumbled unceremoniously back down to the street. Polina waited for a rise, but when there was none, she stooped down to find the stone again. She aimed and launched it a second time, then a third, and finally a fourth before Edith threw the window open and yelled out at the street. "What is it?" Polina placed her hands on her hips and grinned as she looked up at her exhausted patron. "Hey, Edith! How are you doing this morning?" Edith sighed and muttered to herself as she pulled the window shut. She was still muttering when she unlocked the studio door. "How about the next time you want to do that, you just rob me instead?" "Hey, don't test me, lady. I might take you up on that offer." Polina hoisted her paintings and followed Edith inside, then unwrapped a lot of them as her patron readied the morning's coffee. "So what do you have for me today?" Edith asked. "Was supposed to have been 4 paintings, but all I've got is 3. What happened to number 4? "It's a long story." "Well, your work practically sells itself, so I'll take whatever I can get. But yeah, let's see 'em." Polina placed the 3 paintings onto the dining room table and switched the overhead light so Edith could get a better look. "Oh wow," Edith said as she examined the new pieces. "I quite like this one here." She pointed to the Study of a Severed Ox Head. "Thank you, I was quite proud of that one myself." "So what about names?" "No, the names are all pretty straightforward. There's Study of a Severed Ox Head, Still Life of a Homestead Door, and Landscape of Montezuma." "Montezuma?" "Mm-hmm. Have you ever been to Montezuma?" "I have not, no. Why?" Edith laughed softly. "No reason." "Well, I feel as confident in these as I have in any of your past works. And you've certainly proven your worth, so..." Edith clicked her tongue as she thought of a price. "I would have said 450,000, but after that stunt you pulled with the window pane, I'm knocking you down to 400 even." Polina laughed. "Oh, come on, you know you love me." Polina rode home that day with a check for 425,000 francs, and for the next 3 days she went about her life like normal. She bought groceries, had breakfast with her neighbors, and worked on her newest paintings. One of these was a recreation of her portrait of a window, only now she painted the valiant hero as a total silhouette, as to not reveal his race. She hoped to have finished and sold the painting before her next inspection, and thought she'd have at least another week before that happened. But this hope was dashed when she heard the hum of a proceeding vehicle from outside. The Gestapo approached. She peered through the slit of her curtain and watched the Onyx Mercedes make its way down her dirt driveway, accompanied by 2 other cars and a motorbike. She counted the men pouring out of the 4 vehicles as they each came to a stop outside. 12. 12 men, not counting Bab or Heinrich. She took a deep, solemn breath as the dozen Nazis stood at perfect attention and as their senior officer made his way to her front door. He knocked, then let himself inside before Polina had a chance to answer. Following close behind, Heinrich leaned against the doorframe. He smiled devilishly as he looked Polina up and down. "That's a lot of men you got there, officer." "Oh, they're not here for you. We have some business in Paris, and we're just stopping here on the way. In fact, Heinrich, could you close the door? This doesn't concern the boys outside." Still grinning, Heinrich slammed the door shut, then leaned his weight again against the stovetop. Bab pulled a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. He glimpsed at the silhouette of a window painting, then turned back to Polina. "Polina Banderas, sit down, please." Hesitant, Polina pulled the chair opposite the officer and sat. "Just a few days ago, I was having coffee with a Frenchwoman, just before I paid you my last visit. At the end of our drink, I told her I was going to check the paintings of a local artist. She asked me who, and I said, Polina Banderas. She squealed with excitement." Polina was mostly still, but tapped her foot nervously beneath the table. "I saw your latest works on auction this morning. One of them, the Ox Head, was going for nearly 300,000. I believe the final number was 280, something like that. It got me thinking about what I'd said to you last time, how I'd always wanted to place a bid myself, but didn't have the money to do so. Well, it's funny how these things happen, since I actually got a piece of one for free. Would you like to see it?" Polina did not answer. Her eyes were wide as saucers as she gripped the seat beneath her. The officer gestured to Heinrich, who pulled the curtains shut. All of them. The room was dark now, and what little light seeped through the closed curtains lit the officer's pale skin like a biblical inferno, as he produced a small sheet of white canvas. The edges were frayed as if it had been cut with a knife. Something was painted on the other side. He placed it on the table, then flipped it over. It was a little man with a tiny torch, burning a portrait of Hitler. With tears welling in her terrified eyes, Polina glanced from the officer down to the portrait, then back to the officer. "What now?" she asked.